Welcome back. The topic for panel 6 is soft IC partnership in the compound security environment. Moderating the panel is Dr. Amanda Wenks-Butler from JSOU. Providing their perspectives are a distinguished panel of experts, including Dr. David Ellis from JSOU, Lieutenant General retired Mike Nagata, a retired senior SOF leader and the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center's Director of Strategic Operational Planning, Colonel Mike Obadal, the former commander of JTF NCR and a U.S. Army officer, and Mr. Peter Cloutier from USAID and JSOU. Dr. Wenks-Butler, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today for this panel. As Dr. Oakley has mentioned, we are going to be speaking of the SOF and IC partnership in a compound security environment. So with that, without further ado, we're going to go through some of our great panelists we have. We're going to start it out with a little bit of a bio background, and then we'll go right into it, okay? First and foremost, we have Colonel Mike Obadal, who has over 25 years serving as an Army officer who has knowledge and experience as operations and a liaison officer, J3, and a commander of both aviation and joint special operations task force. And then following that, we will have Lieutenant General retired Mike Nagata with over 38 years of active Army service. And today, he works as a strategic advisor and senior vice president for CACI International. He is a distinguished senior fellow for the Middle East Institute and affiliated with several other DC-based think tanks. We also have Dr. Dave Ellis, who is a resident senior fellow at JSOU, who holds a doctorate in international relations and comparative politics. Research in democratization and development and identity of conflict spans for over 2 decades. And finally, we're going to have Peter Cloutier, a foreign service officer in the USAID, serving as an office director. He has developed innovation strategies and advancing interagency partnership in a range of technical fields. He has skills as a successful negotiator with host country governments and sector coordination with bodies within interagency. So without delaying our lovely panelists from speaking their minds and their experience, we will start off with Colonel Mike Obadal. What are your thoughts and experience with SOF IC partnership?
Hey, Amanda, thank you very much. Just like to also extend thanks to Craig, Dave Oakley, Dr. Wilson, necessary attention to what I think is a changed mission and environment, and clearly put together an exceptional collection of experts in different fields over these days. And then I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel and the challenge of having to speak first, although if you've seen General Mike Nagata speak, you think, I just don't want to follow that guy. So I'm at an advantage today. So when I first saw or heard the term compound security environment, I honestly had to do research. And what I came to eventually was Dr. Wilson's piece. And it talked about global economic, health, resource conditions, climate change, evolving conflicts, and then, of course, the rise of great power and regional power competition. Some of these, I think, as I read that, I said, okay, some of these have evolved clearly, but others were just simply overshadowed by other things over the years. And an example I give is, for years of operating in West and East Africa, we were singularly focused on counterterrorism and our mission. We knew about Chinese influence. We saw Chinese roads and ports. We would see Huawei and the integration of 5G or a Chinese mine, but it was a data point. It was an afterthought. It wasn't our mission. It was overshadowed by what we were doing. And I think today now those have come out of the shadows and are clearly now as large or even larger a threat. But we were like so many other special operators over the past 5, 10, 15 years that deployed with that focus. And even in semi-permissive and especially high threat environments, even though it was a high threat environment, it remained uncontested to U.S. military. We could still accomplish the missions that we needed to accomplish. And I think today, all of those factors combine to really compete and contest with our presence and our ability to accomplish the mission. So if you think about a special operator today going out to just about anywhere in the world, they're going to be vulnerable to advanced propaganda, to anomalous health threats, high-end technical collection, and even a lifetime of continued visibility to our adversaries. So if it's compound, complex, complicated, whatever you call it, I think the military and special operations, instead of fighting and winning wars, it's now a permanent part of U.S. global politics. And, deterrence, defense, compulsion, those were all missions that existed over the decades. Going forward, though, I think we can expect our operators to be to use their resources to influence, to inform, and to compete at levels below armed conflict. And I think we're seeing that today. The interagency coordination becomes far more complicated as we do that. Even though counterterrorism seemed difficult for IC and interagency coordination, it was pretty straightforward. We could all get on board with some of the things that we wanted to do. And I think SOCOM is addressing each of these threats and challenges and the interagency coordination piece with technical, doctrinal, procedural, even structural changes. But in my mind, there's farther to go. So yesterday we heard Del Daly and Doug Wise, others highlighted kind of how far we've come in 20 years. That was through liaison officers and relationships between leaders. And I agree that it's far better than it was, but we are not postured for the next 20 years. And we've got to take some steps and prioritize, in my mind, kind of 3 different areas. And the first one is integration. So if we're truly going to compete with Russian, Chinese global operations, SOCOM has to be fully integrated into the interagency and even up to the National Security Council process. And to do it, by doing that, we can inform, we can influence, and we can educate both back down into Tampa and throughout the formation, but also into the other agencies on what SOCOM can do, is doing, and is capable of. That means that we have to progress past liaison officer, and we have to go past that status into empowered and fully functioning offices inside those agencies and departments. So I'm going to define those 2 terms: empowered, able to communicate into SOCOM at multiple levels of command, and to represent in their agency that they're sitting in SOCOM equities and clearly represent those 2 leaders. And that means evolving from just a presence to an actual player in the room where decisions are being made. Fully functioning is the second part. This means that you have to have personnel numbers that allow day-to-day involvement in topical departments inside organizations, and you're vertically integrated at multiple levels instead of having episodic touch points. So an analyst that is embedded in a regional department in the IC or in the interagency has the relationships and the understanding, but most importantly, the trust of those partners, because they're there day to day. They understand how the IC is beginning to lean, how they will react to certain things, and can start to influence and educate. The importance of embedded, right, and that integration, I think it's lost on a lot of us that discussions and decision-making in the IC are done in very decentralized pockets. If you aren't in these rooms, if you're not in these discussions, you miss the opportunity to influence, to inform, and almost all of the information that's driving the decisions. So that's integration. That's number 1. That's the first step. But we have to improve the second thing, which is communication. And it seems mundane. And it is, frankly. But in the past 3 years, as the commander of JIADF NCR, looking into the IC and the interagency, but also now as a military officer in the IC, looking back into DOD, this is really challenging, and it's a technical problem. So our systems aren't fully compatible, and if it becomes difficult for leaders and others to communicate rapidly and easily, they just aren't going to do it. I have 4 different accounts on 4 different systems, doing things like transferring materials, plans rapidly and easily is non-existent. A simple thing that isn't simple is video teleconferencing, and that our systems are not compatible. We have a process. It's a difficult one, and it's not reliable. And I had an IC senior come to me several weeks ago and say, "We're making decisions today, and I need to speak to the TSOC commander." And I said, "Absolutely." And we couldn't make it happen. And 2 days later, we still couldn't make it happen. And we lost that opportunity to inform. And I think DOD and SOCOM especially has the impression that they make decisions in a centralized chain of command and with centralized communication. And it's just not factual. It's not a clean process that we like. And so I think when we design our IT systems and we allocate resources in the POM, we have to ask the question, are we making a priority out of quick and reliable communications into the IC and into the interagency? Are we able to communicate rapidly at the right levels of the decentralized intelligence community? So that's the second part, is communications. And the third part is, even if we fix the first two, how do we hold ourselves accountable? And I think when we look back at the 60s, 70s up to Grenada, what we saw was the services were operating somewhat together, but in generally parallel lines, but not as a joint force. SOCOM and the interagency today and moving forward in this compound security environment, I think can be compared to those services in that era. There's some cooperation and visibility, there's limited communications, and there are competing interests that will converge. So joint operations today, when we talk about joint operations, it's not a novel topic. It's not something we say we have to do. It's simply a part of the landscape. It's just there. It's part of everything we do overseas. It's part of every officer's career, and it's embedded throughout doctrine. It's not something we have to address anymore. It's how we live our lives. This only occurred, in my opinion, because of Goldwater-Nichols. Congress had to actually force the military to become joint. And now, 30, 40 years later, we are there. I don't think for interagency cooperation and coordination with SOCOM that we have to go that far. And frankly, I don't know if any of us want Congress mandating how we communicate with each other and how we integrate. But we have to take specific tenets and apply them to us to hold ourselves accountable. So for instance, we have joint PME, and we talk quite a bit about it, and we put a lot of resources into it. Do we have interagency PME? We don't. Do we have joint requirements for officers? Do we have interagency requirements? We do not. We have to eliminate the negative perception of an IA assignment and a DC assignment in the IC and the interagency by officers. And that means that promotion boards, senior leaders in SOCOM, senior leaders in services have to view this as a positive and a required thing for the evolution of an officer over his or her career. The communications methods, we have to fix those. And the last, frankly, 20 days in August, this August, highlighted to me the significant challenges that we have communicating rapidly and easily between the IC and all of the different areas in DoD, with one singular exception, JSOC. JSOC's investment in officers around Washington, D.C., and in the communication systems that can rapidly and reliably communicate into the IC made a significant difference. Finally, as far as using tenets from Goldwater-Nichols, requirements for integrated planning. JOPS is part of every joint task force and every XORD. Are we mandating those same things, the integration and the planning with the interagency and the IC when we launch on new efforts? So we've come a long way. We've made a lot of progress, but we're not postured for the road to come. We have to prioritize integration, communication, accountability. And to me, prioritization only occurs if you take money and people from something you really like doing and putting it towards those things. Otherwise, it's just a continued topic that you have. All right, Amanda, I'm going to stop there and move on to the rest of the panelists.
Thank you very much, sir. So as we go on and speaking off of what Colonel Obadal has spoken, I believe that Lieutenant General Nagata has significant points that he was going to speak on that touches with exactly what Colonel Obadal just went over. So, sir, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you to you and your colleagues for inviting me to be here today. And it's always great to be in an audience with such an illustrious group of panelists. First of all, I want to stipulate up front that I agree with everything Mike just said. And everybody who just heard what he had to say, please remember, he is speaking from a deep well of personal experience here, not only in his current position, but the years he was running JIATF NCR, he got an up-close personal look at the realities of one of my favorite adages about DoD and interagency cooperation. And that adage went, probably still goes today, fighting the enemy is really hard. Working with each other is even harder. Or as Stan McChrystal once said to me and all the other task force commanders many years ago, he said, we all need to remember collaboration across the US government is an unnatural act, and it always will be. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it's freaking hard. And if leaders don't pour relentless energy and personal commitment into making it work, first of all, making it a reality, and then making it work, it won't happen, because natural cultural gravity will pull people away from each other in ways we will always end up regretting. And then there'll be some blue ribbon commission after some horrible event happened that will, for the upteenth time, publish a finding that says we need stronger interagency collaboration across the United States government. Okay, let me move on to my more prepared remarks here, but I couldn't resist saying that given all that Mike just said. I'm not going to repeat something that I'm sure many others have already said in this forum. Very obviously, if one compares the state of special operations and intelligence community relationships pre-9/11 and then compare them with the reality today, there's no comparison. It has gotten so much better. I mean, in some ways, because I remember how awful it once was. I mean, we didn't like each other. We refused to talk to each other. We damn sure didn't share information with each other. That has completely changed. But it changed because of the press of necessity. You know, in some ways, we really didn't make these improvements, neither we nor our IC partners, because we just one day saw wisdom and realized, oh, we'd actually all be better if we worked as a team. We were up against the press of necessity, which was the events of 9/11 and everything that happened after that, where we had to confront the reality where neither of us were going to succeed alone, that we needed each other. And oh, by the way, that extended to a whole bunch of other agencies of the United States government as well. USAID, State Department, FBI, the list is darn near endless. But we're talking about the IC here, so I'm just going to use that as my example. We basically followed my favorite Churchill adage about Americans. Americans will always do the right thing, and in this case, it was interagency collaboration between the IC and the military. After they've exhausted every other alternative, we literally tried everything else other than working with our civilian colleagues, but it didn't work. And so finally, out of necessity, we found a way to begin building relationships. And the rest of my remarks are really going to focus on that last word I just used, relationships. And I'm not talking so much about professional relationships as I am talking about personal relationships. The real magic, in my view, that has emerged after 20 years of trying to forge effective relationships between special operations forces and the intelligence community were primarily built on not the relationships that are created after one phone call or an exchange of business cards. They were forged by people on both sides of the aisle deciding that they needed a personal relationship with the person on the other side. So I can count literally dozens of personal friends I have in various intelligence agencies that I have served with, I've deployed with, that frankly, I went out of my way for to help because I wanted a personal relationship with them, and they did the same with me. I was not unique here. And that created a degree of strength in those relationships that created astounding amounts of operational progress for both the intelligence community and special operations forces. If you look at some of our most complex and historic operations over the last few years, and you dig down into who the individuals, both on the IC and SOF were, who planned and conducted those operations, what you'll discover is a web of friendships among and between those people, not just people who exchanged business cards one day. So it's so much better. But as Mike has already said, when I compare the strength of the relationships we have now created with the very different and in many ways far more complex and dangerous and daunting challenge that our near-peer adversaries are confronting the United States with, I wouldn't say we're back to zero, but this has pushed us back to zero because we're going to need a degree of special operations and intelligence community relationships that, as good as they are now, they're now no longer good enough. They're not good enough. Now, the good news is we know how to make them stronger. We know how to make them stronger because we recognize, or at least we should recognize, that all it takes is exerting the time, energy, and risk tolerance necessary to build even stronger personal relationships between special operations forces and our intelligence community colleagues. And again, I really want to hammer this point. I am talking about personal relationships, not just professional relationships, because it is personal relationships that can withstand the difficulty, the complexity, and the occasional failures that will inevitably happen as we undertake integrated operations together. Professional relationships will shatter far more easily than personal relationships will. Now, regarding the challenge that we face, it's important to remember that despite the fact that most people in Washington, D.C. use the same term for what we face, some version of great power competition, very few policymakers agree on what the definition of that term actually is. I think there are probably people in this forum who've heard me say publicly before, I'm very confident if I were to drive my car back across the river from Arlington, Virginia, where I live, and find 12 of my former policymaker level colleagues at random, hand them each of them a blank sheet of paper and say, please write down your definition of great power competition, I'd get 12 different answers, or at least 12 divergent answers. There may be some commonality, but there'll be a lot of differences. So the working definition I am using for my final point here is that what the United States is in is a strategic war over American influence that we are currently losing, by the way. We are not winning, we are losing. Now, the good news is we built up so much influence after World War II. It takes a long time to eat away all of the influence America has. But we're on the path to losing that influence. Now, there are aspects of that struggle over influence that involve kinetic force, but most of it does not. Most of it involves the struggle over American influence, whether it's in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, wherever it is, it's a struggle over American influence. So what should that tell us about SOF-IC relationships? That should tell us that the bulk of our current relationships in special operations forces that are primarily with the counterterrorism elements of the intelligence agencies of the IC are not sufficient anymore. We're going to have to extend our web of relationships, not let go of our CT relationships, because we're still going to have to do CT, but we're going to have to embark on a relationship building exercise with a whole bunch of people across all the agencies of the intelligence community that we've either never met before, or we've never worked with before, or we're completely oblivious to because we had no reason to ever talk to them. That won't be easy. My final point is this, and this is something that I know Mike knows very well. I'm sure there are several people in the audience that know this as well. One of the most difficult aspects of doing what I am suggesting, assuming I'm right, is that SOF is going to have to overcome a deep-seated prejudice against, quote, too many SOF in Washington, D.C., unquote. I'm sure there are a lot of people in this audience who are either smiling or cringing at my use of that term. But it is quite real. There is a visceral reluctance trending towards hatred against having large numbers of special operations forces personnel doing long-term assignments in Washington, D.C. And oh, by the way, you can't establish the kinds of relationships I'm talking about if you don't have repeated long-term assignments in Washington, D.C. I did 4 tours in Washington, D.C. That explains why I have a lot of relationships. That will be difficult to overcome because a lot of the reluctance comes out of the Department of Defense, but we have to overcome it. Because if you're just a tourist in Washington, D.C., where, oh, by the way, 90% of the intelligence community is located, you're never going to have the personal relationships we need to create the collaboration we're going to have if SOF is going to succeed, let alone the IC is going to succeed in the war over our own influence that we are now immersed in. By the way, here's my answer. Back when I was still in uniform and somebody would start complaining to me about, hey, damn it, Nagata, there are too many SOF in Washington, D.C. My answer is, well, I do notice that there are tens of thousands of Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps service members in Washington, D.C. 24 hours a day because all the service staffs are here. There's what, a couple of hundred of SOF in Washington, D.C.? What's the problem? But you know what the problem is. They just don't like it. Okay, I'm a retiree. I can get away with saying outrageous things like this. Thank you for allowing me to vent my spleen here, Amanda. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, sir. You've made some great points that I myself agree with, especially having SOF up in the DC area, because they need to have some sort of level when it comes to communications. Because honestly, I see folks speak differently than SOF people. I could tell you that from experience myself. I could talk to a SOF individual and they'll just look at me with a blank stare. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people know what I'm talking about. But without further ado, we're going to swing on over to Dr. Ellis to get his perspective. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and hopefully I'll be able to claim academic prerogative instead of a retiree prerogative. But my comment is basically going back to the theme of the conference, which is if the question is, can we forecast the future based on our history? I think the answer has to be yes, and that is once we relieve pressure on them, we're probably going to see failure across Somalia, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, Yemen, Eastern Syria, and very possibly Iraq. I'm going to make the case, hopefully over the next couple of minutes, that the reason for that is because we are structured wrong based on 20th century concepts of the nation state. And that doesn't necessarily, frankly, that probably ended in the 1990s. And we have not updated the way we organize ourselves for that reality. So I personally think that what we experienced in Afghanistan in the last couple of weeks is actually a Desert One level catastrophe failure that should, not with the withdrawal itself, but the lead up of the 20 years to that point. And if we don't correct the ship structurally, then we will fail in strategic competition too. And if my comments are in any way sharp, it's only because I desperately want us to succeed. So why are we losing strategically despite tactical and operational victories? Well, I suggest that it's about the paradigms that we employ and how we understand the world. Paradigms give us a vocabulary for interpreting the world, logics of causation. They help us identify theories of victory, theories of operation, and who we are and what we do. Unfortunately, SOF have been employed in too many cases with a broad set of paradigms that underlie the totality of the United States government. And so we're at the tip of the spear in a lot of what we do. And so we have a particular responsibility and mandate, I think, to critically evaluate those paradigms. The first is the paradigm of the state. This is natural because of who we are. We deal with national governments. They are privileged in international law and other kinds of relationships, but they are social fictions. They only exist to the extent people voluntarily give their agency to recreating them on a daily basis. All our doctrine, though, is built around this social fiction of the state. Our COIN doctrine, CT, counter threat network, and we presume that it exists rather than make it a question mark in what it takes to create the state in the first place. This is a problem because many of the states that we presume that we are going to support, and I'd even extend this out to proxies such as the SDF or YPG or however you want to look at it, constitute a threat to populations in a way that our affiliation to the concept of the state doesn't comfortably allow. So if we adopt the Weberian notion of the state as the monopoly of the use of force, well, then that only compounds it because that doesn't really deal with legitimacy factors that are necessary for creating long-term sustainable strategic effect. The second paradigm is that of the welfare state. Not only do we focus on a Weberian government, central government, we also kind of assume a welfare top-down, materialistic kind of support to the population. This is very 20th century economy of scale, which doesn't necessarily fit well with the cultures of a lot of populations and their level of development. If we adopt materialist interpretations of legitimacy, then we are, by extension, diminishing the importance of religion, culture, and other ideological factors in determining what is legitimate. So it also tends to help force us to overlook domestic anarchy that exists after internal conflict. Third, we assume that the Western liberal international order is a good thing. Normatively, I agree with that, but that really doesn't matter. And I would argue that it doesn't necessarily matter in foreign policy either. There's a difference between a rules-based international order, which is rooted in sovereignty, such as we created in 1945 with the United Nations and the Security Council, versus the Western liberal international order, which has a host of postmodern values that do not necessarily fit with local needs, survival needs, cultures, or governmental structures. It may be one thing to say we want to work towards that. It's another thing to say that we have to implement it immediately based on the local conditions. It's also possible to say that our strategic adversaries, or some of them, might be willing to live with a rules-based international order, vice a Western liberal international order. So we have to decide which is more important to us and how we want to play this system. Fourth, we mirror image a post-industrial world onto a pre-industrial world in many places that we operate. We fundamentally can't see or sense near subsistence, agricultural, nomadic, or even littoral fishing communities or modes of living. And they relate often to pre-national territory culture and governance patterns that do not fit comfortably with that state-centric paradigm. As a result, we focus on our deployment calendars, our processes, rather than align them with the modes of living, such as the crop calendar, the nomadic periods, the cyclical fishing cycles, et cetera. And so we're never really in sync with the populations we really want to influence. Fifth, we in SOF remain basically committed to a false theory of victory, and that is that the counter-network operations can sufficiently take adversaries off the battlefield in sufficient quantity over a sufficient period of time to allow the government to come in and fill the space, whether legitimate or not in the eyes of the population, in order to secure the monopoly use of force. All the talk about intel cycles and AI and all that, to me, really doesn't matter if we don't get that basic idea of what is legitimacy and a matter of need to the local populations. I think strategic success is about building resilience amongst cultural factors or local needs at the community level, rather than focusing on a state and radiating out from there. Unfortunately, this is not what we do. Sixth, we employ a development model rooted in the same paradigm of economy of scale and project management principles that are best suited for an industrial world, and then wonder why, when we try to implement them in complex pre-industrial environments, they don't necessarily change very much. And seventh, I'd say the IC is wedded to the same state-centric orientation with a focus on hard power. The IC has a tremendously difficult job. It is very hard to do. It requires a special skill set. I'm not advocating that the IC needs to change 100% its background, but it does draw from a set of professionals with a common set of training and experiences, often not in the social sciences, which is what I'm really kind of describing here. As someone who's been advocating for those skills in the IC since 2009, I recognize that there are just certain things that we're not going to do. So the question becomes, how do we create a system that allows for that knowledge to be absorbed into it? Unsurprisingly, the structures we created for the US government were based on state-to-state conflict in the post-World War II environment, and when the idea of state-centric politics was unproblematic. But as I said, since the 1990s, we've been living in a world where subnational social structures have become more and more prominent, as we've heard before over the last day and a half. If we continue to prosecute CVEO as a separate thing from strategic competition without looking at the underlying social structures, I think we're going to replicate the very problems that we've experienced, because both are essentially about non-kinetic population influence. In short, we can't win, we can't succeed unless we rethink our organization for national defense around the idea of social structures instead of state-on-state conflict. The gray zone is simply a manifestation of how we think about the environment, not the way social structures compete for relative influence. This also matters in terms of how we view education in a career path. If theater, country, or issue-oriented matters become the central focus of what we do, then the education trajectory of senior leaders and NCOs matters all the more, because it will take dedicated time to learn about those areas, those issues, in a way that allows them to truly act strategically, because it just won't be part of our culture naturally. Unfortunately, though, the rates of deployment have caused education to, let's be honest, be family time, and without necessarily a orientation of aligning where the person goes to school for what to study with a follow-on assignment. So how we change the incentives is necessary on this. All right, if what I'm saying is accurate, then the unit of analysis must move from the state to the idea of the social structure. States are a type of social structure, often a supercharged one, but not necessarily the most important ones, depending on the environment. The underlying social structures create what is called a superstructure of the state. And those are building blocks which we have to focus more heavily on. I think IR, international relations, is moving in this direction. I think the IC is lagging behind. So that requires a whole different set of social science education along the way. If both the CVEO and strategic competition missions are going to require a different set of education, we need to think in terms of, instead of in terms of the intelligence community, but a system of knowledge creation that can swarm different sensors within the system, whether scholars, business, NGO, other interagencies, partners, whoever it might be, who have a sense of the system different from our own, so that we can get a better appreciation, strategic appreciation of how the operating environment is unfolding, and therefore how we can shape it. I think the SOF and IC currently lack this knowledge system, which is a huge impediment for the future. This is possible to change it. Well, how do we do it? My personal opinion, and this has not been vetted by anyone else, is that the responsibility lies on the shoulders of 06s and GOFOs. Only they have the power to stop the machine. Only they have the power to reorient career incentives. Only they have the ability to say no to deployments because we are not ready and are not going to get it right. In my experience, the majority of 06s and GOFOs are great Americans who really want us to succeed, but they grew up in a world of states and in a system that focused on state-centric kinds of or counterterrorism-oriented operations. So if we can't get them on board, I think we're going to continue to replicate the same mistakes that we've seen leading up to Afghanistan. This also, and I hate to say this, but means we need to check whether or not the personalities we elevate are the right ones. So Generals McChrystal, Petraeus, and Admiral McRaven, great Americans who did extraordinary things in a moment in time to adapt the organization, in the midst of crisis, may have been phenomenal in their own way. But can we say the changes they implemented for operational purposes were sufficient for strategic purposes? On this, I think the evidence indicates the answer is no. And this is a hard thing to say, but I think we have to at least offer the opportunity to say that we should look elsewhere, or might need to look elsewhere, for inspiration of who we are as special operations professionals. And finally, there's no amount of AI and ML, big data that can achieve the results necessary in the intel community. This is about designing and shaping the future. This is not about counter network. It is about nurturing networks, which is an intentional collision of different people together for purpose. And all AI and ML can do with their algorithms is replicate the past. They can't tell you what to do to navigate the future. So if we rely on algorithms, we are going to fail. And in some, we need a new paradigm within the IC and within SOF that emphasizes social structures, new questions for the IC, and a new knowledge system that adequately addresses the compound security dilemma. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We did have a question from the audience that wanted to speak specifically on your thoughts on modern dominant form of statehood, the nation state being only one form, and as such, that the suffix of the states and the idea of statehood endures.
Absolutely, but how you build up a state and what it is constituted by matters. So if we try to preordain that we are going to have Afghanistan with a government that looks like a centralized Western welfare state, we're going to lose, because that is not how the population's structures are operating in the present. It's not to say that you can't build towards that. It may be, though, that you don't start with that you have to actually explore what the patterns of life and the social organization is given how their history has evolved. I can also take the example of the jihadis in the Sahel. They're actively creating the idea of an empire of Messina based on a history in the 1800s that was an emirate. So if they're appealing to the lack of governance in their mind, or legitimate governance from Burkina Faso, Niger, and Nigeria, they're creating an alternative with this idea of the empire of Messina, or the emirate of Messina. That could be more meaningful to those populations than the states that we want to reify with those hard borders that are not meeting their needs. So how can you take that social trajectory and off-ramp those populations into something that is more meaningful, where the states provide some resilience? If we start with the state as, hey, this is what we learned in school with this capital and these borders, we're going to lose. We are not getting it right if we start with the assumption that the central government is the answer.
Thank you, sir. So with that being said, Dr. Ellis provided us an academic standpoint perspective of it. Do you have any thoughts on that, General Nagata or Colonel Obadal? Coming from the operations side of the house versus academic?
Well, I'll take the first swing at it. David covered so much ground. I'd actually like to comment on all of it, but I won't put anybody through that. I want to just pick up one thing, because I completely agree with his characterization of how, well, I'm going to say it differently than he did, but I think it's completely consistent with the way he's described things, how power of many different varieties is shifting away from the Westphalian state structure that we have all known our entire lives, and our parents and our grandparents have known. You know, it's become kind of almost like settled law that this is the way it has always been and always will be. Of course, anybody who knows history knows that's not true. The Westphalian system is a relatively modern construct, and there's nothing that says it's going to live forever. And I think one of the concerns that I've heard, I know one of the concerns I've heard expressed by various international partners I've had is that they believe that if the traditional role of the state is not willing to adapt, it's going to die, because there are rapidly rising alternative powers around the world that are not that do not adhere to the Westphalian state system. We call them non-state actors, but regardless of what name you give them, there are organizations out there that already have the power that rival a nation state. I'll name two. Google and Amazon have power that rival a nation state. Matter of fact, I think my kids would testify that if Amazon.com dissolved, their entire life would be destroyed. But regardless, the power of the non-state actor is a new reality. So, and I'm going to connect it to one thing I said in my own prepared remarks if you are competing for influence these days, and I believe there is a grand strategic war over American influence today, you're irrational if you do not consider an alliance with a credible, reliable, powerful non-state actor who has the ability to influence the environment in ways that you cannot. That may be distasteful to some. It may even sound immoral to some. It's certainly non-traditional, but this is a digital version of proxy warfare. As more and more power moves into the non-state system, any actor vying to succeed in this arena is nuts if they don't consider a powerful non-state actor as a useful instrument if they can wield significant power and influence, and increasingly they can.
Thank you. Colonel Obadal, do you have anything?
I'd just like to pose an example. In Libya, right? We recognized the GNC and Siraj as the government, and that's who we would deal with. The only problem was the rest of the country was controlled by General Haftar and the entire military. And we refused to acknowledge that he was the power. And we have gotten better about that over time, but we have to apply that model to things like the SDF, now to the Taliban. How do we engage with somebody that we have treated like we have with the Taliban to meet the interests that we have? And then finally, the global countries, the global companies like General Nagata talks about, they have the resources to do things that the United States government will not. And I think we're seeing that on the tail of our withdrawal from Kabul, as we have a number of NGOs, and we have a number of commercial entities that are willing to do things and take risks that the United States government will not. And how do we coalesce that public and private partnership to help meet our goals? Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. And not to throw a question right at you, sir, but just out of curiosity, what are your aspects of it, Peter? Peter Cloutier?
Yes.
Okay.
Am I to begin or?
No, I was asking what your perspectives were dependent on what Dr. Ellis and General Nagata and all of them were speaking of your thoughts on modern dominant form of statehood and nation state being the only one form as such is that the suffix of the state and the idea of statehood endures. What are your thoughts behind it?
Oh, many thoughts, and hard to contain in the amount of time that we have. So actually, it's part of what I plan to say. So if I could just roll that in,
Yes, sir.
I'd be happy.
Go right ahead.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And let me quickly say thank you to the university for inviting me to this panel, to David Oakley and all the others involved for facilitating and managing the forum, and to the other panelists before me for their deep insights and perspectives. I believe that I come to this panel at the right time as a civilian, as a Foreign Service officer with nearly 20 years overseas, mostly with the United States Agency for International Development. My own insights and perspectives shared today are derived from this experience. They are my own views, not those of the United States Agency for International Development, the Joint Special Operations University, or the United States government. To frame my perspective given the topic at hand, I returned to President Wilson's Back to the Future scene setter, in which he talked about the compound security environment related to converging transnational compound security dilemmas, a growing weakening of nation states, and a weakening of the liberal and international system itself. I'd like to begin by taking 3 questions from the Joint Special Operations University white paper series and propose them here, while taking a civilian lens to thinking about how they might be impacted by intelligence. For the first question, we heard President Wilson propose the following at the onset of this forum, as well as in the white paper series. We may be doing things right, but are we doing the right things? I recall the widely circulated quotation originally from Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous texts, often credited to Einstein, that simply say insanity is repeating the same mistakes and expecting different results. I read a Joint Special Operations University monograph recently that used the more visceral adage of a hammer looking for a nail, in the sense that predictability can be a trap when the expectations of a predicted outcome limit the consideration of other options, ideas, or actions that might otherwise detract from success in achieving that prediction. Such predictability lends itself to scientific methodology, where we reduce phenomena to root variables to ascertain cause and effect and accumulate progressive knowledge along those lines, potentially sidestepping a greater appreciation of the context. What happens when our government culture manages challenges of this magnitude in a reductionist linear modality? I echo one of President Wilson's important hypotheses, and that tactical, discrete, sequential approaches to problems could worsen compound security dilemmas and lead to unintended wider conflict. When we look at one political effect on which we can all agree we need in terms of interactions with partner countries or relationships, it's influence, which is necessary to achieve integrated deterrence. But what is in the minds of those partner country collaborators? Do we know what they really want, or do we assume it? Do we know what their people really want? Do we want the same things? Do we know what we really want? What we do see emerging in the multilateral and academic spheres is the concept of human security rising into prominence. The United Nations defines human security as an approach to assist member states in identifying and addressing widespread and cross-cutting challenges to the survival, livelihood, and dignity of their people. It calls for people-centered, comprehensive, context-specific, and prevention-oriented responses that strengthen the protection and empowerment of all people. As our minds open to thinking beyond the nation state in the wake of our 20-year experience in Afghanistan, we can rethink a grander strategy of not just reacting or responding to crises, but changing our mindset to how we adapt to the environment that creates the conditions leading to the conflict to begin with. Thus, it may not be the operation itself that is so critically under review. It may be well upstream of it, and what will the intelligence be used for? So from a more generalized and atmospheric view, we can look at Special Operations Force's 12 core skills, specifically special reconnaissance. What could that information be used for? It may not be how they go about getting it, but for what end and with whom? It's not just special operators who speak local languages, acquire deeper understanding about the environment, and have vast networks of contacts or relationships within the coast countries we operate in. The same could be said for civil affairs operations, counterinsurgency activity, and foreign humanitarian assistance in theory. Intelligence could then be adapted, perhaps not so much in content, but in context. Now, for the second question, is the current organization of our people correct to achieve our stated objectives and goals? From our national security and defense strategies to the vast publications from academia and think tanks on security, one bottom line they all share is that the military cannot do it alone, especially in strategic competition. One term that has risen in use and frequency is the Joint Interagency, Intergovernmental, Multilateral plus Commercial Mindset, or JSOU, and how it could be used to think about, respond to, and attempt to mitigate compound security dilemmas. Many of us in foreign assistance agree and have been trying to do similar things within our own JSOU constructs with development stakeholders, many of whom work in conflict and post-conflict environments with explicit peace and security objectives. But on the contrary to what we may believe in principle, what many of us see in practice is akin to a whole of government hashtag of sorts, associated with the latest initiatives that attempt to merely coordinate or at best synchronize the plans and actions of various departments and agencies. The situation lends itself to the insanity principle I mentioned earlier, but more from the visual of bureaucratic inertia that contests anything new based on the amount of time it takes to perform something new on top of what they already are responsible for. And while those intra-agency responsibilities may lead to interim achievements and successes, the interagency equation results in a sum that at best can only be defined by adding up the variables in the equation. What we see in a non-reciprocal conflict equation tends to be factors multiplied rather than merely summed, mostly because so many of the variables are left unaddressed and for so long. Not only do tactical, discrete, sequential approaches to problems potentially worsen compound security dilemmas, and lead to unintended wider conflict. But when our thinking continues to be based on government-centric, linear authority and development models, we're going to continue missing the dynamics that drive the operating environment. Going back to the monograph I mentioned earlier, it concludes in saying doing wrong really right still goes wrong. It asks the question, what if terrorism is actually just a symptom, not really a problem? Organizational failure, it says, more often comes because of what an entity did not do than because of what they did. So let me turn to the final question. Are the processes by which the organization receives and integrates data adequate? I will pause as I show an interesting comic I saw several months ago that so profoundly reinforced the image of various platforms for security in my mind, including human security from our American perspective. Could you please post the slide, please? Okay, so how each persona chooses to engage the tree would drive such processes. In this analogy, one could interpret the upper images and the lower left image as varying degrees of doctor-patient orientation. What can I do to make this tree more useful in this case? A solution with the most economic incentive, or the most functional in terms of utility, or the most practical in terms of development? But the lower right image reinforces the notion that this doctor-patient orientation does not see the tree for what it is and what role it already plays. The doctors are often imposing allopathic remedies into compound security environments where chronic, not acute disease is figuratively manifesting. It's not to say that allopathic medications do not provide some benefit, they do. It's to reinforce this reoccurring theme that quick fixes could end up making the situation worse. And that's not the quick fixes that are wrong per se, but the mentality to hastily use them in reaction to events we see from the outside, rather than devote the time to understand the deeper dynamics within a focus area and focus on modalities that support a country or a region's own ability to resolve them. To loop back to intelligence, it's not about what is given, but further upstream in the form of why and how it's derived. It could be about breaking an inertia within our own mental models and behaviors that we need to figure out in all aspects of our foreign affairs. So to conclude, let me end on a quotation by the famed Irish singer and activist Bono from the band U2, who wrote this lyric back in the early 1980s. We thought that we had the answers. It was the questions we had wrong. Until we better understand our questions, how do we know what intelligence we need and for whom? That's all for my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir. It's definitely a little bit different coming from a civilian's viewpoint compared to a lot of the audience members. I'm sure we all come from a military and or government perspective, so we see things a certain way compared to the way he would see it, Mr. Cloutier, the way he saw it. And that image that he did put out shows exactly what it is of the tree. How do we all see it a little bit differently? That could be put in place of counterterrorism, what we have been fighting for the past 20 years, and moving forward to the GPC and how we see that compared to the civilian sector may see it, compared to what local populace may see it versus the Western society may see it as well. And one of the biggest challenges we are facing right now is the open source network that is available out there. All the social media and all the news and all of those things are getting pushed out. So with that being said, we're going to take a couple steps back from a question from the audience, which is open for the entire panel to answer. But if GPC is a focus on American global influence, should DoD be highly prioritized as a department of execution of its desired outcome and end state? For example, as in maintain our influence over the areas of influence.
I mean, I'll take that, but I don't think I captured the last part of that. If it's a war of influence, and then what came after that?
If it is a war of influence, then should DoD be highly prioritized as the department of execution for the desired outcome?
Yeah. Okay. It's a good question. I'll take it because I'm the one who posited that. I think the best definition of GPC is it's a grand strategic conflict over our own influence. I think this is actually a good example of looking in the wrong place for the right answer. It should be irrelevant whether or not DoD is in the lead for activities intended to either protect or create stronger influence for the United States. There's no, in my judgment, there is no single agency of the United States government that has a monopoly on this. And it's dangerous to even try to identify one. The right approach, as was probably evident in my prepared remarks, is to instead ask a different question, which is, how do we stitch the various elements of the United States government together so that together we either protect or advance our own influence, or in some cases recover our influence? The Department of Defense has a large role to play for some obvious reasons, and I guess for some less than obvious reasons. One very important reason is DoD has more money than God. We've got all the resources. So even sometimes when we're not necessarily the best suited for doing something, we're the only ones that can afford to do it. And unless Congress reapportions the defense budget, that's not going to change. So there are going to be places where we're not necessarily the right instrument to do a particular act in the influence environment, but there literally will be no other alternative because nobody else has the money to do it. Nobody else has the resources to do it. That's kind of an obvious reason why DoD has to be in the middle of this. A less obvious, but I would argue a more important reason is because given the size of the Department of Defense, a million people in the Department of Defense, we are more likely than smaller agencies and departments of government to have a very large volume of relationships around the world. There are more U.S. service members posted abroad than any other agency of the U.S. government can afford to distribute. But it begs this question: does the Department of Defense train, organize, equip, and professionalize its forces to engage in acts of influence, legally, ethically, all that and a bag of chips? But do we train, organize, and equip, operationalize, and think in terms of campaigns along with the rest of the interagency to protect or advance our influence? The answer to that is no. And if we don't fix that, we're going to regret it. I think we're already regretting it.
Hey, Amanda, if I could add in just very quickly, I was going back and looking at, when did we finally realize that we were in the Cold War with the Soviet Union? It was around 47, 48, right? And when you look at the creation of the institutions that actually helped us with influence around the world, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of them started up in the early 50s. So it took us somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 years to really get our act together. I think we're somewhere at about year 3. So the fact that we're having this conversation is good, but it does beg the question of, do we need to revive some of those institutions like the U.S. Information Agency, which distributed out responses? Country, as I understand it, people down at the country level could respond to misinformation in real time without having to send things back to DC to get cleared. They just knew their local environment and could deal with disinformation as it occurred. We don't do that. We've highly centralized everything because we shut it down after the end of the Cold War. So those kinds of things can be adapted, and some of that isn't necessarily a military capability. We just haven't restructured ourselves to engage in that kind of thing. Now, having said that, if you're going to build influence, the military does have a very strong case to play in what's called soft balancing, reinforcing second and third level powers who are worried that if they individually push back, they're going to get swamped. And so as an anchor power, the military is very clearly one of those basins of attraction around which larger sets of influence can be developed and then spread out diplomatically and in other ways.
Thank you very much, sir. So when we're speaking about influence, what is you as in the panelist perspective, as in soft, where should we invest in order for us to have greater influence? Should it be in the cyber domain? Should it be in the MISO? Should it be in PSYOPs? Anything of that nature? What is the best way to invest within the DoD, in particular within SOF, to have the influence that we do need.
And man, if I could, I'd like to talk about that for a minute, and just go back to the original question. You know, I think it's important that we look at how our two main adversaries address this. Do they put the PLA and the Russian military in the lead? No, they don't. And that doesn't mean that we copy what they do, but it's what General Nagata talks about. How do we stitch together various elements of the U.S. government to do this? And right now, what we see is the only place that this really comes together is at the National Security Council process. And that's too late. When it comes to how do you campaign plan for influence in regions and around the world, how do you best utilize soft cyber operators or soft psychological operators? That can't be done in a vacuum and then presented at the deputies level. That has to be integrated into the campaign plan of the intelligence community. And they can be utilized because they have all of the right skills and they have all the right capabilities, but they don't have the right authorities. And they don't have the right integration into what the rest of the U.S. government is trying to accomplish.
I mean, I'll pick up on that. I think we have two, let me say it a different way. In order to achieve the goals that I think everyone in the SOF community would like to achieve, and that is we do our part. We become an important part based on the skills and abilities we have of the United States' overall strategic efforts to protect our interests and advance our interests when it comes to great power competition. We all want that. But there are two things that have to be addressed or it's not going to happen. Actually, there's more than two things, but these, in my view, these are the two most important things. One, I'm just riffing off of what Mike just said, but I'm going to say it differently. The amount of risk intolerance in the United States government when it comes to anything to do with influence or information operations is almost suicidal. It almost doesn't matter how much capability we have in these arenas. And I would argue we don't have enough, but we certainly have some. But our inability to effectively, swiftly employ these things with a degree of agility that a complex environment requires is almost nil. It was far, when I was the J37 on the Joint Staff responsible to the chairman and the secretary for special operations, when I got a chance to compare how hard was it to get a very complex kinetic strike done in a very sensitive place to kill a terrorist, and how hard was it to get an influence or information operation approved, the kinetic operation was 10 times easier. Even though nobody would die from the information or influence operation as a general rule. But the risk intolerance is astonishingly bad in this arena. If we don't fix that, it almost doesn't matter how much capability we have, we won't be able to use it. The other one is an internal problem, and I'll apologize up front for anybody in my SOF family that I end up offending by saying this, but I still think it's true. We actually have formations in special operations forces that are trained, organized, and equipped and professionally developed to do either information or influence operations. They are our civil affairs and psychological operations communities. So here's a provocative question that I won't try to answer. I'll just let everybody's brains explode in the virtual audience. The next time we have to stand up a very important Joint Special Operations Task Force because we have a major influence or information campaign about to cook off, are we ready to appoint a civil affairs or PSYOPs officer to be the commander of that most important SOF task force in the inventory? The answer is probably not, but it begs the question, why not? They're deliberately trained, organized, and equipped to do this in ways I never was, and I spent 34 years in SOF.
Hey, man, if I could add in, one other way to think about this is influence is an effect, not an MOS, right? So if we're looking at how we think about this. This isn't about a person sitting in a room trying to plan a message to go out to somebody. It's what are the physical activities on the ground that provide positive utility to a population, and how do you disseminate out for further effect? And this isn't about the military just doing it. There are lots of other, as Peter was mentioning, the GMC. Good grief, how much corporate social responsibility money is floating around there doing absolutely no real good because they don't know how to engage the local populations? Millions of dollars, in addition to the other kinds of development assistance that's being provided by our partners and allies. So if we start to think about the total volume of available influence that we could bring to bear if we were only to really get in line with how the population see their world and what's the next stage of advancement from their perspective, that's influence. It's going to be a little bit different in some of the rural areas of the world versus the urban, but we can do basically that same kind of thing, but it requires a different set of questions, a different kind of sensitivity to the environment than we're asking now.
Thank you very much, sir. That's one of the biggest highlights, that the underlying issue that we were all discussing is partnership within the community, to not only within IC and the SOF, but also with non-government agencies out there. So thank you very much for providing the academic standpoint pertaining to that, which is always good to see. But with that being said, we are coming close to our time. General Nagata, do you have something? You look like you're about to say something.
Oh no, I've shot my mouth off too much. Thanks for putting up.
So I just wanted to thank everybody on the panel for coming out and speaking their point on what their beliefs were based on their knowledge and experience pertaining to the IC and the SOF partnership, and where we have been over the past 20 years and the ways we need to move forward. So I just want to thank everybody that's been on this panel, as well as everybody else that has been part of this forum. Lots of wisdom, lots of knowledge. Thank you very much for everybody's input, as well as thanking the audience for coming out and bearing with all of us while we ramble on our thoughts and knowledge. So with that being said, thank you very much, everybody. This concludes the forum, our portion of the panel.
Hey, thanks, Amanda. A fantastic discussion that, was highlighted how far we came over the last 20 years, which is very positive, but also a very sobering discussion about how far we still need to go in the SOF interagency partnership. So thank you to the panelists and Amanda. This brings our session of the SOF IC partnership in the compound security environment to a close. Thanks again to our panelists for their comments and perspectives.